Hello, hello, good evening and welcome everybody. My name is Ian Robinson, Vice Chair of Newcastle BCS. Thank you for joining us today. Hope everybody's well. You can't have missed on the news lately about the talk of increasing fuel prices, particularly electric, and about the climate change and the recent COP summit. We're delighted today to have with us a guest speaker, Tony Sudworth from DWP, who's going to talk about sustainability in greening government, how digital can play its part in helping to sustain the planet. So without further ado, over to Tony.
Lovely, thanks Ian. So good evening everybody. Just as a sort of warm up before I get started, if it feels like there's excessive preaching at you, or it feels like I may have a larger than usual soapbox on this one, it's only because I feel very, very strongly about this subject, and it was one of the reasons for returning to DWP when I realised the scale of what we were trying to do at DWP in terms of 2.5 billion spend on IT in contracts, over 120,000 users. There was an opportunity here to make a real difference. So what I'm going to walk you through is, yes, let's talk about sustainability and greening government. But as all good civil servants know, you have to see the bigger picture. So what I will also include are a welter of stats on climate change, showing you where the drive for this has come from. Now, all right, so that's just to give you a little bit of background as to why I'm in the role that I'm in at the moment. I'm going to cover off some of on the next slide, looking at the agenda. What is greening government? What is net zero? And that is a question, it's not always as clear as you think. Then looking at how we've translated a strategy into a plan, the sort of principles we want to work by within DWP, and the analysis in terms of how we broke it down. And then the ask. And I'll explain to you where we are on that one as well, because one of the things about this is that climate change is not something that for most people is happening right now. There are warnings about it, and I'll cover that when we get to it. But the point is that there are also a lot of other concerns for people right now: costs of living, the budget from the spending review, and what the implications are for services. But I think it always helps me to hang on to the idea that even if people say there isn't such a thing and it's a big hoax, in actual fact, this is a manifesto for better energy independence, very topical at the minute, green jobs, sustainable, livable cities, use of renewables as opposed to fossil fuels, and clean water and air. So even if it was, and I personally don't believe it is a hoax, but there are still some benefits. This is not an either or. This could potentially be a win-win. So I'll come through this. I will try and break for some questions, because I'm hoping there will be a few, but let's take it from now. So I want to just share with you the scale of the challenge, and that commitment. It says, how ambitious do we want to be? Well, at the moment, in law, the UK as a whole has to reduce its emissions by 78% by 2035. And we need to get to net zero by 2050. And if you look at departments like DEFRA, which is basically the leading government department on this, they're planning to be net zero by 2025, but they've been at this for a little while longer. So in terms of what I wanted to do was to try and get a wider DWP response and not just digital. Then talk about how we were going to mobilise the people to make this happen, because it won't happen on its own, and then get agreement on how we scope and fund it. Now, that was the ask that I had when I first rejoined DWP back in October. Now, for the purposes of net zero, I know this might sound obvious to you, but I really wanted to make sure that this is clearly understood. Net zero is where the carbon emissions from DWP are equal to the carbon that we remove from the environment. Now, that is very distinct from carbon neutral, which is where potentially you can buy your emissions or offsets but you don't actually do anything to lower emissions. So net zero allows you to measures to lower the emissions, and it's coupled with measures to remove emissions. Okay. Now, at the moment, there's a government commitment for 2050 for this, because, as I say, that's the law and so on. However, other departments are coming forward earlier than that. HMRC, I think, is 2040. I think DWP is potentially going to go for 2040. But there's also an element of stick, where it's mandatory to work towards this. And from a government perspective, it becomes a condition of spend delegation and approval. If you don't have, for example, impact assessments for climate change, then you will not be allowed to spend. And that is a very different environment now, because we've always had the GDS requirements. Those have now changed. This means net zero is different to zero emissions, because, as I told my boss, unless I advocated the closing down of DWP, which I'm not, this is going to be tough to reach. There will always be residual emissions, because whatever we do, if we do it in the best possible way, it'll be lower than it is today. So it's as much about people and culture as infrastructure, processes and services, and I hope to show you that. So a little bit of a call to action from here. On the left-hand side of the screen is a survey. Now, what we've actually got here is that I lack information and guidance about what to do, over half the people. This is coupled against 46% of people think, I don't really think I need to change my habits. And I don't have and I also, nearly 40% of people think that they don't think individual efforts can have an impact. Well, I hoped to disprove that, but we'll cover that off. So there's a wide range of opinion out there. This is not done and dusted, no matter how much you actually hear. The point on the graphic on the right-hand side is just to show you that based on what we know today, we are going to go past a warming of 1.5 degrees with all the resultant environmental effects, and I'll cover some of that a little bit later. So at the minute, we are looking, policies in place suggest 2.5, but at the moment, the best one is that we are actually potentially heading for 3 degrees. And at that point, it would affect an awful lot of people, but I'll cover that again later. So you probably heard a lot about the International Panel on Climate Change on the news, and they've had another report out this week. This one came out, this was part 2, which came out in February. And if anybody wants to dispute the science, I get that, okay? But this report in February was compiled from 34,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies, and it was approved by the 195 countries. So there is agreement on describing what it is, not so much on what we do and when we do it. So their conclusions is everywhere is affected. About half of the global population, this is between 3.3 and 3.6 billion people, live in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change. Last year, for example, 128 million people were affected by the climate change in terms of severe weather, either long-term or short-term. And we are already seeing mass die-offs of species from trees to corals. It's already happening. If you look just now in Australia, there has been the 6th bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. So it comes back, but as we warm the seas, that may take more and more, and we might not get that much of the reef back as we go forward. So at the minute, the view is that if we can hold everything to 1.5, this is the critical level above which you start to get irreversible effects of climate change. If you look at coastal areas and small low-lying islands, they face inundation if we go above this 1.5 degrees. I don't know if anybody have caught the speech by, I think it's the Prime Minister or President of Barbados, where she basically said that this is the difference between survival and going under. Yep. So this really matters to certain people, to certain countries in a physical way. And some countries have agreed to conserve 30% of the Earth land. But we may need to do more. The comment that I had was that we may need a bigger planet, and obviously we're not going to get that. So we have to make the best use of what we've got. At the moment, there's a new report, as I say, that's come out in April 22, where it says there's been some progress. 18 countries have sustained reductions for longer than a decade. There are some countries that are now powered entirely by renewable energy, mostly in the African subcontinent, but they're there, all right? But again, this is where the wealth comes in, is that the largest amount of emissions come from the wealthiest 10% of the planet's population. So perhaps if they contribute the most, they are going to have to potentially make the biggest changes. So things like diets in plant protein, low in meat and dairy. But the view today is that at the minute we are likely to overshoot the 1.5 degrees based on what we've seen, okay? And right now we're currently on track for 3 degrees. And this, as I say, could affect billions of people, particularly in Africa and Asia. If you would like to look at, there's something called the carbonmap.org. And if you have a look at that, what it does is it shows you the effects of where the emissions were produced, and a lot of the emissions come from the Northern Hemisphere, and then it looks at the risks and the people most affected, and that's the Southern Hemisphere. And that is the basis for the fair transition discussion about paying for past emissions to mitigate the effects of current ones. But that's, again, another discussion. Money is being transferred, but it's taking time. In terms of a carbon budget, I don't know if those of you have come across this before, but it is a concept that talks about the amount of carbon emissions that we can emit to keep us up under 1.5 degrees of warming. Now, at the moment, that suggests that in about 8 years, we will hit that target. Now, at the moment, we don't have any reduction in our emissions. They have climbed continuously over the previous century. And if you look at the graphic, what it basically says is that we've released 1,000 gigatons between 1850 and 1999, and we've released half that again in just 15 years. Now, that's a consequence of economic development done in a particular way. The point is, there's not a lot of released carbon available that we would actually be able to do without impacting on this 1.5. So that's just something to think about, is that where can we make the biggest difference? And if you look at the difference, again, on the graphic on the right-hand side, in by the 2nd of January on any one year, an average UK citizen has emitted more carbon dioxide than a citizen of the Democratic Republic of Congo will emit in a year. Yeah, so you can see that the balance of emissions is considerably skewed. And so this is where, again, where does the impact fall the most? Potentially on those countries that actually can least afford it. So just to cover off a couple of, make things a little bit clearer here. If you're carbon neutral, your emissions are offset. And offsets allow rich companies or countries to buy their way out of the problem. It doesn't allow you necessarily to reduce your emissions. But net zero is the residual emissions are neutralized. So this implies things like planting of trees, carbon capture. There's a really good system in Switzerland, which is looking at a company in Switzerland that actually has a machine that removes carbon from the air and converts it into rock. But it needs to scale because we need a lot of that. So we're working out what we're trying to do in this area. But carbon neutrality is not the same as net zero. So one of the things in terms of language here is that we have a description of emissions. So if you like, scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions, which are controlled by an organization. So for instance, you have that plus the indirect emissions, which generate from the purchase of electricity or the organization. All right. And as far as that's concerned, I tend to think of those as the operational emissions. Okay, now scope 3 can only be described as a bag of worms because it's the supply chain, and it's really quite difficult, as I'll show you now, is when you look at the sorts of things that are actually included. Look at point 6 and point 7. Now at DWP, we are now heavily into hybrid working, at least we are in digital. So that means I'm actually commuting into the office potentially 2 days a week rather than 5. So if we then account for that, then we will see a reduction. All right. But if you take an iPhone 7 and you look at the carbon that's embedded in that device, that carbon, over 80% of the carbon is in the production of the device, not in its use. And as yet, we still don't pick up scope 3. All right. So that's where we're going in the future. So let's take a break from me talking to you. Are there any questions in the chat at this stage, Ian?
There are no questions at the moment in the chat.
Everybody's stunned. There are a lot of facts and figures in this, okay? So I appreciate that. Bear with me. I think we're recording this, so you can pick this up at your leisure if you want to. So the sorts of things that we're talking about is how does sustainable IT help? And the sort of things that we've been looking at is using energy efficient devices, greener devices. That's quite straightforward. The use of data centers potentially can actually reduce by a factor of 7 for each transaction. Hybrid working, just as I've alluded to, just 2 days a week obviously reduces emissions by about 40%. And reduced e-waste, so circular economy and repurposing of devices. I was talking to an organisation just the other day that actually takes old government devices and then either donates them to charity or resells them. But they also do things like upscaling so that they put extra RAM in and things like that. So if you extend the device life by, say, 2 years from its standard 3 to 5, you will there obviously knock down the average annual emissions count. So that's the sort of simple logic we can do. But the point is that you need to measure it. If you don't know it, then how can you tackle the bits? So you need to know what's possible, track progress. If you look at GDS and Francis Maud's approach to data, expose it. If it's not perfect, then let's fix it after that. But let's start somewhere. So that way we say, for example, we extend the device life for an additional 2 years, or we set new thresholds for suppliers. And we do have those for procurement within government, which basically says all suppliers by 2025 must have a path to net zero statement to be a government supplier. Them's the rules. We don't enforce it yet, but I think we will. And we need to actually try and make scope 3 as well. Don't just offset the supply chain. And there are a few studies, they tend to focus quite clearly on what we can actually measure at the moment. So those are the sorts of, that's the broad picture. I wanted to cover off a little bit more background, just so that, and then we'll get on to what we're doing at DWP. At the moment, there's a threat and there's a prize. Now, if you look at the figures on the left, these are the temperature records for 2021. And call me, maybe it's just me, but I do like the idea that the highest record temperature in the world was actually recorded at Furnace Creek in the United States. That seems appropriate to me. But those figures, if they were sustained, those areas can't be lived in without either artificial support like air conditioning, but people certainly can't work outside in those types of conditions. Now, I made it personal because I looked at the land projected to be below the annual flood level in 2050 for Warrington, the town that I live in. Okay, and if you look at that map, let me tell you that accounts for about at least a third of all the whole town regularly being affected by flooding, from the River Mersey especially. So that is how it brings it home to you that this is personal, or this can be very personal. If you look on the top right, though, this is a coral reef off Australia, which was found at a deeper level than the normal coral reefs. And here you can see that it's retained its viability simply because it's in colder water. What was originally the cold water from the sort of temperatures we used to have. But that means that anything that's higher up is being very adversely affected. So if we raise the temperature of the water of the seas, then we will effectively have to accept the loss of large numbers of habitats. The picture of the whales is just one I particularly like. The idea that sperm whales actually go to sleep about 45 meters down. And that's sort of natural phenomenon that we are in danger of affecting with this temperature rise. So some of these are pictures from COP26 on November the 6th. There was a march through Glasgow, and I was on that with the Greenpeace group. I appreciate that. Didn't ask my boss beforehand. I just thought I'd just check afterwards. Too late. But these are some of the pictures from it. So there's a sense of fun and some of the really good jokes. The one I like is the one in the middle at the bottom. It's got so bad that even the introverts are here. And there were thousands of us. It was really quite something to be part of a 6-hour march in the driving rain, but it didn't seem to make any difference. People wanted to be there to put their point across. So I'll just check there, Ian. Is there anything else that anybody wants to raise in this one before I dive into what DWP did?
Hello, yes, we do have a couple of questions.
Yes,
good. First one from Naveen. I understand we do our best to have control over climate change, but global level, there's been large fires in Australia and Russia themselves involving around 500,000 square kilometres. So how could we offset those? So I'm guessing the question is, we can do a lot of things in the UK, however, it is a global problem. And are we actually going to solve the problem?
If I'm being honest with you, maybe. In the UK, we can do and tackle what we can control. I get that. The mechanism for getting other countries to sign up to and then do the sort of things you're talking about, we can't get the Russians to control the fires in Siberia, for example, or we can't stop the fact that in Australia there are bushfires followed by severe floods. We can't do anything about that. What we can do is use possibly the COP26 framework to make these governments actually implement the commitments that they said they would do. And you're right, but without that, without agreement, without governments doing what they said they do, then no, I don't believe we will solve this problem, and we certainly won't be able to do it just with what we do in the UK. The UK accounts for about 1% of total greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. If you tweak that to look at the historical emissions, it's about 5%, but it's still small in comparison to countries like India, China, the United States, and Russia to some extent. Okay, so I take your point. Best I can say is that we have a framework in place. Let's hope that we can actually get that framework implemented.
Thank you. And the second question we have from Paul, is there a list of contactable regional climate leaders in the UK? If not, should we have one?
So I'm not aware of any regional ones. What I have got is access to a huge government network, which actually looks at this. So it includes the things like HMRC, Home Office, Environment Agency, a Cabinet Office, and so on. So that I already have the details for. And there are any number of support groups across the country. Now, in terms of regional groups, there is a BCS Green IT group, which does work across government for specifically, or across the country, specifically for green IT, if that would help. But I'm not aware of anything on a regional level at the minute.
I think there's an organisation called NICO who work closely with the National Innovation Centre for Data based in Newcastle. From a regional perspective, that's the only people I know of.
But there are national bodies like the Carbon Literacy Trust, and then there's also IEMA, which is a standards body, which allows you to actually work with them to actually implement standards across the organisation. Like, for instance, this week, I've just done my carbon literacy training. If that's so, there is some help, but yes, actually, that's a very good point. We do need to get out and start linking areas of the country together.
Thank you.
Is that okay for now?
Yeah, I was coming from an angle there, Tony, that it basically, I think people, that there is some skepticism about climate change. It can be an unfashionable thing to discuss, but I'm thinking that certain people would be useful for people to be able to contact if they had any issues, or even support if they were getting involved in any government elections or anything like that. So it's really a case of mobilizing in a way to get greater awareness and to get past this idea that everything's going to be all right if we just leave it as it is. So yeah, I'm just thinking, I don't know, maybe it would be a case of contacting one of the organizations that was mentioned there and seeing if they could help in devising something like that.
I certainly think the BCS Green Group would be a good place to start with queries like this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Thanks.
I mean, one of the things that I don't get any commission for this, okay, so bear with me, but there are a couple of books that I used in terms of talking about how to talk about this. And one of the things I came across was a video on YouTube, and it's 4 minutes, and it says, how do you talk about climate change?
Yeah.
And it just explains, it tells you it's really difficult to just preach at people and say, and then if you don't agree with me, you're crazy. Okay, so that doesn't work. We know that in all sorts of areas of other areas of life. So my point was that 4 minute video is a really good way to help you make those introductory conversations. There's a couple of books though that I can recommend to you. One is called How Bad Are Bananas?
Yeah.
Which is basically the carbon footprint of everything. So, for example, it's got details on every sheet of paper you print on average is about 6 grams of carbon. If you send an email with an attachment, it can be anything up to 50 grams, depending on the number of recipients. And did you realize that Teams, for example, is environmentally friendly? Because if you attach a document in Teams, I'm not trying to sell this, all right? I'm just saying that this is the sort of thing is where if you post it once instead of emailing it out to 50 people, yeah, then you generate less carbon doing that. So that's a really good book. And then the other one I read was called Our Final Warning, 6 Degrees of Climate Emergency. You might need a stiff drink for 5 and 6 degrees, okay? Because quite frankly, the scenario painted in there of 5 and 6 degrees is, no thanks. I don't want that. I need to do something about this. So that's a really that book is a good read, but careful when you read it because you can get some, can be depressing. I know. So okay,
that's great. Thank you.
Do you want me to move on to the DWP approach?
Yes, please.
Okay. So what you can see here is a thematic where you know the one about how do you eat an elephant one bit at a time? Well, this idea for us was that it was difficult for us to say, right, we just need to do all of this in one go. So what we tried to do was baseline, we'll break it down to start with into cloud and applications and devices, because those are distinct groups. Then you've got services, which is how do you design the services that we use? The people. So what can they do? and what do we want them to know. So that's fine. Estates already, in DWP particularly, has a really good program in place to measure carbon usage and use of green electricity and so on. And then we realised that if we get commercial and procurement on side, then this will force the use of sustainability criteria into tendering and procurement activities. So we broke it down into these 6 areas. Started out benchmarking what we know today. What are the operational emissions? Try and work out where the gaps are. And trust me, there are lots of gaps. There's so much we don't know, but let's see what we do know. And then we put it in. Then we want to put it into a carbon dashboard so we can see this is where we are today. If we're going to get to net zero, so what does that glide path look like? All right. So where are the big areas that we can do something about? So we wanted to identify work that's already underway, and that's easy in one respect because we are migrating to the cloud. Okay, we are extending the life of our devices from 3 potentially to 5 years with our new procurement for laptops and so on. Then we're going to talk about, okay, what else might we do? How do we scope? How do we change things ever so slightly? And this is a critical point. I just want to get this across. If we do stuff now, it will be cheaper for us than sitting in a meeting in around about 2038 going, damn, we're not going to make our targets. Yeah, that's going to cost a lot of money to make wrenching changes at the last minute. So if we make changes now and give them a chance to bed in, we'll see huge payback in that respect. But then we wanted to talk about phasing. What do we do first? And last November, DWP set up a sustainability forum with the great and the good deputy director level, who with all areas of the organisation represented. So we will have an overall approach, and this is where I'm working on the IT side of that. So those 6 particular areas. Now, one of the things that we've trying to get across is that there is a degree of risk. Normally you would say, well, DWP produces services which are reliable and scalable, and we can actually make sure that we pay the 199 billion that we pay out every year on benefits and pensions. Yeah, we make sure it goes out when it should go out, to the right people and to the right place. Now, what we were saying is that if you look at one of the digital goals on the right hand side, provide reliable, secure services. Now, at this stage, climate volatility can affect the physical assets which you run. So I don't just mean flooding, I mean electrical outages. Those of you that were affected by Storm Arwen will know all about that. And if those risks come up realised, then they will impact our ability to run our operations. And as we mitigate them, the later we leave it, the more costly it will be to do. So if we do the things to eliminate or to get to net zero, we can reduce our existing risk, and so on. So legacy infrastructure, fragmented data, and we can talk about getting those into digital services which are run in the most sustainable way. If we don't look at this, then we're risking our digital goals for DWP. That's how we framed it. And the Plan A talked about climate risk and broke it down into litigation. If services, say for example, benefit payments weren't made, we could potentially be sued. Supply chain disruption, things like storms which break down and stop us having saved some of the materials we've had from China. Loss of productivity, impact on pensions, change in demand for products and services. So if it's more difficult to travel into a job centre, for example, people might start to demand online services and so on. And if you look at the top right, change in resource prices. Well, we've seen a lot of that just recently. Now, that's not driven by climate change necessarily, but you can see the effect that it's had on the economic activity of the country. So what we were trying to get across is we're sustainable. We were serious about what we're trying to offer, but we need to have the support to do it. There's no trade-off. We'll get both. We'll get other ambitions helped by this. And we were also saying, well, look, we're the second biggest IT department in government, so we should lead. So at this moment, what the priority became was, right, so let's baseline this so that at least we have a figure to work to. And then we add sustainability into existing roles. And I have said to my boss over and we need to measure and measure again so we can track progress. And in 3 years' time, you won't need a sustainability lead because it will just be part of what we do anyway. Now, there's a legal basis for all of this, which I just wanted to get across to you, is that in 2008, we had the Climate Change Act. Now, the government commitment at that time was to reduce greenhouse gases, or GHGs, by 80%. Yeah. We then signed the Paris Agreement, which was talking about keeping global temperature rise well below 2 degrees and to limit the temperature increase to 1.5. That was agreed in 2015. And in 2019, we amended the Climate Change Act, where we committed to a 100% reduction in GHGs by 2050. We then started the fourth carbon budget. And at this point, what we're saying is that the UK will be carbon neutral. What that should say is that we will be net zero by 2050. That's the legal basis. Now, for government projects, or IT projects in particular, there's a circle here, which we've identified, which when you sum it all up, it means that much as you'd like to do this, there's an element of you will do this. And it starts with the Green Book, so sustainability business cases, that's fine. For example, when you are now using the Green Book from the Treasury, you need to account for carbon emissions at £250 a tonne. That's a lot. And imagine if that came out of your SR allocation as well. But that's another question. That's one example. If you look at spending controls from Investment Committee, it will start to affect if you done the assessments, have you impacted, or have you done the all the other impacting, plus the work that you've got on hang on a second, the work that we've done on spending controls and internal governance. If you have proved that, I've raised this with the IPA project reviewers, is that at this moment, should we be looking for sustainability assessments in projects? It's gone very quiet while I'm waiting for an answer to that. If you look on bottom right, you've got the Technology Code of Practice and GDS. TCOP is the name. Look in section 12 and just see what the difference has been made for sustainability in terms of how you do projects assessments. The Treasury does a quarterly business review on its large projects, and they are almost ready to publish the criteria. And if you haven't got sustainability in there, we don't really want to talk to the Treasury about not being able to spend your budget. So that's fine. And the last one is it's the procurement advice that came out in September of last year, is that our suppliers need to align to the same net zero standards as us by 2025. And this is the path to net zero. Okay, so these standards surround us already. Now, the difference for government is that it was a soft ask before, we'd like you to. It's now becoming a harder ask. All right, if you don't, we won't approve your spending. So what it was doing is just taking a look at these themes again, just to give a little bit more detail on it. For the commercial and procurement, we are looking at our suppliers. We are triaging our contracts to see which ones will have the biggest potential effect in terms of infrastructure and so on, less so on the service contracts and so on. Service mapping is designing out the carbon hotspots. Now, this is something that we've never done. But what we'd say with this is that, okay, so do we insist on everything that we do being printed? Maybe not. Do we insist that all DWP customers have to attend a job centre? Maybe not for everything. Certain things we do need to see people for, but do we have to do it for all of it? And we design out those services, and we have, for example, a drive to have common APIs for DWP. So you write once, use many. So how do we get those into use within services? We are accelerating the move to the cloud, okay? However, we don't use the sustainability pillar that AWS provides at the minute, so that's something that might change. We could use different processors. We could actually make sure that we shut everything down when we're not using it, that sort of thing. And we reduce device demand, so laptops, desktops, mobile phones. When I rejoined DWP, I took a deliberate decision not to have a new mobile phone. I just used my own personal one, and that's working out okay at the moment. So again, do we replace all devices after 3 years? Well, with our initial laptop selection, we needed to, because they became steadily more unreliable. The next generation one of the criteria is that it should be able to run for 5 years, that sort of thing. And estates. So estates, for example, planned a new building in Blackpool. I don't think they might be letting this one out. And it was class leading. The emissions from that building was absolutely class leading until they put the IT infrastructure in. And then it blew the limits by 100% because we hadn't done it in conjunction with each other. So that's the sort of, you can't do this stuff in isolation. And this last one about people is we need to do carbon literacy so that people know about the background to why we're asking this. And then we talk about sustainable performance and what can I do and what can the business do as a whole? Do we transform in a slightly different way? So one of the things that's gone into the digital story at DWP this year is create a sustainability mindset. And that's what that people objective looks like. There's a little bit more detail here. I'm conscious of the time on this one. So there's a little bit more detail around this as we're talking about life cycle, sustainable criteria. How do we design the services? How do we decommission applications in our on-premise on site? And then there's the acquisition, allocation, use of devices. So for example, can we recycle, pass on to other people and so on, rather than just recovering those devices? And estates, I've talked about that. And again, the greening government, how do we get this across so that people know? One of the big things about change driving is people having the knowledge to do something about it. So we change the processes and the structures. We have a practice structure for the way things are delivered in DWP. So what we would end up with that is, do we change the culture and the basic background to how these things are set up? That's a slow process. So we can do things like cloud and devices, fine. Estates, fairly a little bit quicker, along with commercial. Services and people are the long-term goals. So running through some of this, we've got a high volume of contracts, 2.54 billion overall, and we find that we get a regular change of contracts. So do we use PPN 0621, which is a procurement guidance? How much do we use that? Where do we use it? If you look at this diagram, one of the directors I know has got nearly 50% of the contracts, so I would be wanting to talk to him. The sort of things we've got here is work is already underway to create a service map for all DWP services and how they interact. So where can we create common interfaces and so on? There's a lot of detail here about, for example, making a claim, making an inquiry, connect to review, report a change. Those are the business processes. So how does that map onto what the common components are and what data and analytics do we need? One of the things that I found here is that we were talking about, so what devices do we have on the estate? And funnily enough, we know. But if you look at this, we found that we know the name, we can identify every laptop and every desktop device on the estate. And we can work out average utilization figures, and then we can look at the power usage of those, and then we can make a calculation. So again, starting to pick out the data that we would have here, the Crown hosting data that exists. That's one part of the way we provide our data centers. So we started asking them what data already exists. And look, in here, they've got the carbon totals for one of the rooms at Crown hosting that we've got, and we've got 4. They reckon that it's about 0.5 ton of carbon a year because of their use of renewable resources. So Again, this is scope 1 and scope 2, and we need to work up to scope 3. But some data already exists. So what are we doing already? So we're looking at things like new contracts over 5 million have the 10% weighting. We're trying to get the greening government, the technology code of practice embedded in the way we work. There's some baselining to be done. Then we need to agree how to assure the suppliers, because at the minute it's all self-declared. So whether you can trust that is another matter. The shared channel experience, I was literally talking to them this afternoon before I started here, and we're talking about, okay, so how do we measure the cost per service? And then this way we start to understand how the services map together. So we baseline the carbon footprint of our key services. And then once we've got that, then we know that if we want to replace it, we need to work out what it's going to look like in the future. Code of practice, DWP has a strategy moving 70% of its workload into Azure and AWS. So that's a given. So how do we measure that and get these two suppliers to give us the data we need? Crown Hosting is already giving us some of that data. And then there's the cloud first provision of desktop services, which, if it works, will allow us to remove about 1,000 servers across the estate, which is used to manage our software distribution. So do you see the sort of things we're doing, transitioning into things like OneDrive and SharePoint, where there's one copy of a document for collaboration? But the point is we need to baseline, and then we need to agree an approach and a plan to get to your scope 3. Devices already happening, assets are tracked and recorded, some assets are reused. We will have by the end of January, we had a prototype dashboard that we've been put together by working with one of our consultant suppliers. So we had the baseline of the asset data, and funnily enough, we thought we had a CMDB that did it, a configuration management database. In actual fact, the best place to track device usage is software updates. We didn't realize that, but that's a good one for the future. So one of the things that we're now checking is identifying unused assets and removing them. And we're taking a look of the allocation of devices, how long we retain them for, and what's the life cycle, can we maintain them better, what's the mean time to fix, and things like that. There's a lot in that area. Within people, we're trying, I am always amazed. I just ask the question, anybody interested, and I get an avalanche of people who want to talk to me about this. And I can't formally engage with them just yet, but that's what we're looking for. So we want to do sustainability education. There's the Carbon Literacy Trust, which I've just done myself this week. The Environment Agency has produced a 3-module setup on climate change. What is it? What do we do as an organisation? What are we going to do in the long run? So that's the sort of thing. What are we going to do as individuals? So we need to engage with the people so that people understand what we're up to. We had a digital sustainability campaign in February. So it's simple things. Unplug your laptop, because all the time it's plugged in, it's drawing power, even when it's turned off. It's not much. If you are as sad as I am, you will put a power meter on and you will see that it's about 3 watts an hour. So it's not a lot, but it's there. So estates, we're looking at how buildings and water consumption is managed, but we all need to work with them on how devices and premises interact. So does everybody need 2 screens, for example? Because the emissions from a screen is as great as the base laptop itself. Yeah. So while the estates has got this sustainability management and carbon water management at the minute, that's great. What we need to do is work with us to work out what is the plug-in load that we get, and so they don't design their premises in isolation. So just let me check. That's fine. OK, our next steps is collect the data. We're submitting to create a small team. All right, that's hopefully going to get agreed next week. I've started talking across government. There is Adam Turner at DEFRA, who, what he doesn't know about sustainability in IT just isn't worth knowing. He's been doing this for nearly 10 years. He's a great help and so on. And there are numerous groups which I'm happy to share with you, which talk about IT across government. And we started talking across DWP. So I've done things like the all-colleague calls for digital. I've started talking to operational areas, digital leaders, learning at work week, all of those, just trying to raise sustainability as a topic and get people to think about it. The ask was that we absolutely needed a data analyst. We needed to get the heads of roles to help and get their input from this. We needed business analysts and delivery project managers to support it. And we needed commitment from the senior members across the organisation to make this happen. So we're talking about the baselines, the Sustainability Forum paper to the ET, to the executive team, the top level of DWP is going, I think, in May. That if that's agreed, that will be a huge boost. And then we need to agree the prioritisation and then propose a structure that will allow us to get this done. So, for example, we have a Sustainability Forum, and underneath that there is the delivery arm, which is where I sit with the estates and so on. So those different aspects are all covered. I'll skip through this because this is a huge amount of detail about individual. This is the building I was talking to you about. They designed the building 95.6 kilowatt hours per meter per annum. Put the IT kit in, it went to 166. Okay, so that broke. So that just demonstrates what we actually found when we tried to measure the real life performance, and that's an important part. So next for so in terms of what you and I need to think about, so what does the transition to net zero look like? Well, okay, so instead of traveling in daily, you travel only when you need to. You don't want to go in and sit on Teams calls all day, right? So I work on a corporate device on my desk, or I work on a device anywhere. So that's why we're transitioning from desktops to laptops, so that laptops can be taken with you, work at home, work in the office. Travel regularly to meetings and conferences. I think this demonstrates what we're talking about here, is which events benefit from in-person. I would have liked to have talked to you in person tonight, but virtually is okay. Instead of using a desktop PC, use a mobile device, low energy potentially. So replace devices every 4 years. That's what we do at the minute. Maybe we should have repurposing devices so that they can be upgraded. So at the minute I run Windows 10, maybe I can run Windows 11. We used to dispose of old devices and a lot of the stuff went to landfill. We get the devices reused to satisfy social value. All those things in there are the sort of things that we can do very, very simply. And the organisation PX3 were a great help in working out what are the simple messages that we could do. The other bit I just wanted to cover off with you, this comes from the report this week, brand new, but look at the collapse in the cost of photovoltaics, onshore wind, offshore wind, batteries for EVs, electrical vehicles, and then look at the uptake in those. All right, not so much for the solar power, which is a slightly different case, but all the other ones that their usage is already picked up. Yeah, so at that point what you're finding is that renewables becomes cheaper than fossil fuels, and usually just follow the money. Just a couple of thoughts to finish. David Attenborough, do we fail to see the bigger picture in terms of short-term goals? This is a quote from a speech he made at COP. Kurt Vonnegut, excellent author. We couldn't believe that we are the first society that wouldn't save itself because it wasn't cost effective. Well, I hope I've shown you that it can be cost effective. And the quote at the top of the page, if we can't keep the global average temperature down to 1.5 degrees, then we do 1.6 and 1.7 and so on. We can always prevent things getting worse. It's never too late to do as much as we can. That is a quote from Greta Thunberg. Okay, so as far as I'm concerned, yes, 1.5 is what we're aiming for. If we miss it and get 1.7, okay, that's better than letting it just rise up to 2.5, 3 degrees.